Welcome, everybody, to Friday morning's Lawfare Live morning impeachment briefing. We have decided to continue these since people seem to be finding them useful as long as the impeachment trial continues, though the personnel will rotate. Joining me is David Priest and Quinta Jurecic. As per always, please leave your questions in the Ask a Question box, and we will go to them as soon as we can. Quinta, get us started. What happened yesterday?
So, as listeners who watched yesterday probably remember, we in our briefing yesterday said that we were sort of wondering what the House managers would do with their time on Thursday, reasoning that, they pretty much set out their case, walking through the events that led up to January 6th and the riot itself. So what they did yesterday, it turned out they spent a lot of their time focused on the experience of the rioters, which I think was a perspective that I wasn't expecting, but walking through how many of the rioters understood Trump to have directed them to come to the Capitol, understanding themselves as heeding Trump's call to sort of help make the argument that this is not something that would have happened in the absence of what they're characterizing as Trump's incitement. They also argued that if the Senate does not take action here and sort of clearly delineate that this kind of conduct is beyond the pale, that we could see more violence going forward. And they situated it in a context of a sort of broader pattern of violence encouraged by Trump. They also talked about the effect of the riot on the people who work in the Capitol. So not only members, but also police officers, Capitol Police, and staff, which I thought was very notable because as listeners may know, a lot of Capitol Police officers and especially a lot of staff are African-American, and the effect on Black staff members was particularly severe. They quoted reports of staff members talking about how the racist abuse they received during the riot really, really shook them. So I was struck that they included that as well. They closed their arguments by sort of pre-butting, if you will, arguments that President Trump's team will probably make today. So they ran through why the First Amendment defense for Trump's actions, in their view, doesn't hold water. They walked through why the argument that Trump wasn't given sufficient due process in the House doesn't hold water, and then also discussed the question of whether or not they can prove that Trump wanted this riot to happen, and essentially made the argument that even without witnesses, the material on the table in terms of videos that we've seen since the day of the riot, public tweets and comments, really make the case for them. And then they closed with Representative Jamie Raskin quoting from Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is a text he's come back to again and again, and sort of arguing that this is a key moment for senators to stand up for the American Republic and make a commitment to defending it and sort of redefining what it means as something that is not Trumpist violence.
Mm-hmm. David, they closed yesterday after probably about 4.5, 5 hours of argument. They did not, as we predicted, did not use all their time. How do you assess the aggregate of the manager's performance?
Yeah, I was disappointed, maybe is the word, in yesterday's performance, but probably just because the first day's presentation was so cogent and so impressive in totality. There were things yesterday that we hadn't heard the day before. There were facts introduced. There were elements that were added to the case. I don't feel like they built momentum for the case. So from a purely practical point of view, in terms of, are you going to sway any senators? I did not feel that yesterday. However, there were a couple of important things that did come out. One is the point that Quinta ended with. I thought it was very strong to quickly, concisely, and very clearly pre-butt the arguments. to say, you're going to hear this right after I talk. You're going to hear this, and it's wrong for this reason. And they didn't go on a 1 hour, citing constitutional scholars and all this. They just said, this is what they're saying. This is why it's ridiculous. This is what they're going to say. This is why it's ridiculous. And I thought that was very strong and a good thing to do with their time remaining. Secondly, they did something to take it to the slightly bigger picture. And this was speaking to the people as well as to the senators in saying that impeachment is important not only to punish, but to prevent. Now, that wasn't the case in the first day. The case in the first day was all about punishing for what happened, for inciting this, for being there when it happened, for not stopping it. Putting it into the bigger context yesterday, I thought was useful. I just don't think those two elements needed to take that long and have that much explanation.
Yeah, so I'll point out a couple of other things that they did. One, right at the end, Raskin posed several questions, factual questions for the defense. And this I thought was very clever because I think the likelihood that the defense will actually be able substantively to address these questions is de minimis. But and this gives him the opportunity to come back to this in a closing and say these questions were not addressed. The questions are, in summary, why did President Trump not tell his supporters to stop the attack on the Capitol as soon as he learned of it? Why did he do nothing to stop the attack for at least 2 hours after it began? As commander-in-chief, why did he do nothing to help send help to law enforcement for those 2 hours? Why did he not at any point on January 6th condemn the violence? And if a president did invite a violent insurrection against his government, hypothetically, would that be a high crime and misdemeanor? And I think this was a very smart thing for him to sort of lay down a marker that these are questions the defense has to answer. The second thing that he did that I thought was an interesting marker to lay down was to make clear, both at the very beginning of the presentation I'm losing track of days, on Wednesday, and at the end of the presentation yesterday, that they are not allowed to argue the jurisdictional question again. That this is a matter that, whatever its legitimacy, and as y'all know from what I said before, I think this is the best argument the president has. It is now a decided matter for purposes of this case because it was argued and the Senate voted on it and rejected it. And so I think what he's doing here is he is setting up an objection. We haven't seen any objections so far, save for Mike Lee's retroactive one the other day to something that happened earlier in the evening in the proceedings. But I would not be surprised if we saw David Schoen or Bruce Castor starts talking about the fact that the president is no longer in office. I would not be surprised if the managers objected and said, hey, that's a matter that's been argued and decided for purposes of this case. One other quick note, which I think we may return to later. I think the managers overall did a very good job of closing doors for the defense argumentatively. They've clearly anticipated. I was trying to think yesterday on In Lieu of Fun, Mike Pesca and I had a little exchange about, okay, well, if you were a competent lawyer representing the president and you had to get up tomorrow, which is to say today, and make an argument, what would the argument be? I mean, we all enjoyed having fun at Bruce Castor's expense the other day for the incompetent job he did. But what does a good defense sound like? And I think the answer to that question is it is very hard, because these are actually, because this was a very well presented affirmative case for the managers that makes it very hard to respond to. And so I'm curious how the president's defense today, what its strategic judgments is about how to organize its presentation. I spent a little bit of time on that in today's diary notes. But I actually think it's a super hard question, even if they were a first-rate legal team, which, you're free to judge whether you think that's a reasonable characterization of this group. Okay, let's go to your questions. I am inviting people on screen and will take them in the order in which they show up on screen. Everybody has been invited, and so the order of questions is now up to the latency bias of Crowdcast. Pauline, you got here first. Your question is first.
Okay. What are the chances we might see evidence such as maybe witnesses addressing what Trump was doing during the riots, what he was thinking, what, more just actual evidence of that?
Yeah, so I think, and I'm curious whether Quinta and David agree with me on this, I think the answer to that is that the managers have not forsworn trying to call witnesses, but their body language is strongly against it, and that they are presumptively going to rest on their arguments, not on additional evidence that they can amass. And so what we're going to see is several hours of the president's arguments today, and then following that, questions and answers from the senators, and then a vote, or some closing arguments, and then a vote. I think that's all we're going to see, but they have not spoken the words, "We will not call witnesses." Do you guys have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's completely right, and it seems pretty clear at this point that they don't think that they need them. I think that Joe Negus's presentation at the end of the day, where he essentially said, what more evidence do you want for willfulness on Trump's side, was pretty clear in that they're, perhaps they could call witnesses, but it doesn't seem like they're going to. I believe the Washington Post reported last night that it's not 100% decided, but that they seem to be leaning away from it.
David, why do you think they would make that decision? It strikes me as perhaps the right tactical decision for Democratic senators, but I'm not sure why the impeachment managers shouldn't want it. I think it is
likely, but not certain, that you're right, that they are not eager to call witnesses, all things being equal. But I'm not sure all things will be equal after today and possibly tomorrow if the defense takes more than 8 or 10 hours. Listen, if they say something that squarely puts the issue, let's say, on Mike Pence and says, no, Mike Pence actually knew that the president cared about him and loved him and was worried about him, and that shows the president's state of mind, that would encourage the House managers to call Mike Pence as a witness. And it doesn't have to be the vice president. It can be anybody in that situation where if the defense focuses on somebody and the House impeachment managers have reason to believe that is wrong, that could spur them to try to call witnesses. Short of that, I still stand. I don't think their fundamental case needs witnesses. For full knowledge of the case, yes, Ben, I'm with you. It would be nice to have them and important to have them for all of us. But for the case that they're fundamentally making, they don't need to know what President Trump was muttering to himself and aides during the attack.
I want to know every damn mutter. David Botts, the floor is yours.
Good morning. So with respect to what we would expect from the defense today, do you see a lot of whataboutism, pointing to BLM and saying, "Oh, what 45 did was even less than what happened at BLM events across the United States," and so just let them off. Nothing to see here.
Every single. Oops, we seem to have lost David Priest. Ah, he's back. Every single Black Lives Matter act of violence that is on film is going to be broadcast today. Every single Democrat you've never heard of who has ever said anything in however minor a venue that could be construed as insufficient, or as sympathetic to protesters, you are going to hear today. The Latin term for whataboutism is tucoque, and I think tucoque will be a big part of this defense. What do you guys think?
I'm sure that's right. I mean, look, they've already, I think, gestured at that. It makes it draws attention away from what they don't want to talk about and feeds the anxieties of the base. So I would be extremely unsurprised if they went that way.
Yeah.
What do you think,
And
David?
easily rebutted. Easy for the House impeachment managers to simply say, Donald J. Trump is on trial here, not those protesters and not those Democratic senators.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I think this is, for defense purposes, a useless defense, and it will come at the expense of what I think is actually their most compelling factual defense, and I think their only compelling factual defense, which is that the degree of pre-planning that some of these groups showed suggests that they were not, in fact, incited by anything the president did on January 6th. They were planning what happened for days or weeks in advance.
Absolutely.
And I think that is actually the best defense he's got, at least as a factual matter. And I suspect you will hear less of it because this tucoque defense is emotionally satisfying, both for the president, but also for the larger ecosystem of conservative media. And it involves video. It involves, I'll be very blunt, showing video of black people being violent, which is, this is a staple of Fox News, and that's a kind of an emotionally satisfying thing. And also, I just think at a sort of spiritual level for the Republican ecosystem, this is a party that steeps itself in the idea that it is, we're on the side of law enforcement, we're against rioting, we're against rioters, we're for law and order. And it is very jarring for that group of people to be accused of using violence and rioting as a political strategic instrument. And so it has a sort of strong emotional valence when accused in this sort of playground way. You use political violence. No, you use political violence. You showed me a video of my people doing violence. Let me show you a video of your people doing violence. And so I think it has a real emotional meaning to the people who are presenting it. And that said, I think it is a useless defense, except in that emotional sense, and one that will come at the expense of more plausible ones.
Can I also chime in here and say one thing that I should have said before? I think it's important to understand that argument of, oh, well, people who were out in the streets protesting against police violence, some people who were also out in the streets committed violent acts during that period of time. And so anything we do is fine. That is the same rhetoric that led us to the point where we could get January 6th. That's the same kind of language where you end up with, right-wing militants who are arguing that Antifa is out there and they're coming for you, or that Black protesters, so help me God, are going to, break into your house and steal all of your stuff. I think it's part of it as a distraction, but it's also important to remember that it's feeding into the same sort of ecosystem of fear and right-wing sort of revanchist sentiment that has gotten us to this point in the first place.
Good point. Robert Mihara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I was asking if, given the facts and the arguments that have been made thus far, do you see a scenario where GOP senators might choose to absent themselves from the final vote for various motivations and thereby lower the threshold for the final vote?
David, what do you think about that?
Yeah, this is linked to another question in there about the senators being present during the trial. And this gets to a couple of issues. Fundamentally, the Constitution, the vote is 2/3 of the senators present. Now, you can be in the room and vote yourself present, but not take a vote. That does not change the denominator. But if you are simply not in the room for the vote and don't come back for the call, then yeah, that could lower the number of votes needed, of course, on a 2/3 rolling basis. Also, it's related to the question of, do senators need to be present for the entire trial? Because many people are, yesterday was reported 15 senators were out of the room for much of the time. And this goes to an important issue. It goes back to 1999, which Ben and I will remember well, even if others don't, which is when Bob Barr stood up and made some reference to the distinguished jurors in the Senate well.
Yes,
and Tom Harkin,
Rehnquist's only substantive ruling during the Clinton impeachment trial.
I think it was Tom Harkin of Iowa who challenged that and said, no, we are not a jury. The Senate says, the Constitution says the Senate shall try all impeachments, but no ordinary jury can overrule the chair, the presiding officer. No ordinary jury can decide on evidence. No ordinary jury can decide to end the trial at any time. The rules and the framework we have of this as a criminal case, it's understandable because so many in that room are lawyers and so many people analyzing it are lawyers. And the framing in the media is usually, well, let's call on some lawyers to be the analysts on television to explain this to people. But jury rules do not apply. The senators can essentially do what they want to do within the parameters of the Constitution, which is very, very limited on this. And then the Senate rules, which are not much more. And the rules and procedures of the Senate say nothing that would override the Constitution on the issues of being present and then voting and how that would affect it. Do I actually see senators choosing to leave the room and not voting at all? I think it's highly unlikely. I think everybody will want to be on the record for their base to show that they stood by this maligned president, or to be on the record saying, no, this is absolutely the wrong thing to do.
So Pauline says in the chat that we need a word for Senate jurors. And actually, it is worth mentioning in that regard the Chief Justice's, Rehnquist's, laconic ruling in response to Harkin's motion. It's been 20 years since I saw it, but as I recall it, he said something like, the senator's point is well taken.
Yep.
Senators will be referred to as the triers of fact, which I think was an excellent spur of the moment ruling by the Chief Justice.
I found his quote. He said, the Senate is not simply a jury. It is a court in this case. And therefore, counsel should refrain from referring to senators as jurors.
Did he not say they should be called triers of fact?
I do not, at least not at that time. But remember, Rehnquist wrote a book about impeachment before as being presiding officer, and that may be a quote from inside his book.
Interesting. Okay, my memory is that he specifically said that Harkin's point was well taken and that the senators should be called triers of fact. I will check out the record of the Senate trial, see if I'm right or not. Alice Lee, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I was wondering, so this is kind of back to the witnesses question again. Obviously, they're not necessarily just for the senators, they're also for the public at large. Do you think that and it seems like new information is what gets a lot of attention in the media. So if they didn't have these new videos to show, do you think they would be more tempted to call witnesses just because it would be new information?
It's an interesting question. I mean, my gut about it is that the hesitancy about calling witnesses is driven by an unholy alliance of interests between Republican senators who just want to get this over with as fast as possible and Democratic senators who, knowing that they can't get 17 Republican votes and have no prospect of making headway on that, want to get it over with so they can go on to legislative business. And that that this is really not driven by the needs of the managers one way or another. It's driven by the Senate's perception, which on both Republican and Democratic sides, that there's just kind of nothing in it for them to have an extended trial, given that, one side is bent on jury nullification. Do either of you disagree with that, or is there more to the question than that?
No, I completely agree. And I think Ben, when we argued about this on the podcast episode that aired early this week, I think I made exactly that argument. So I'm glad you've come around.
Yeah, I think my belief, and I continue to believe, that the managers, to the extent they are not pushing for witnesses, look, if you are a generalist and you care about the institutional output of the Senate, things like confirming Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco, and maybe having a government and maybe having a coronavirus relief bill, there's a pretty good argument for wrapping things up as quickly as you can. I'm a single issue kind of guy. I work on rule of law issues and national security law issues, and I want every sentence the managers speak to be backed up by a witness. I want to use this to create a record. But I understand that that's a parochial position, and that, if you're Ron Wyden, you've got to also represent the people of Utah, of Oregon, right? And so I think there's a legit question here about the particular interests versus the general interests. I do think the manager's position should be to ask for witnesses. Because
do you think that they're assuming that the public opinion has kind of crystallized at this point, and there's no reason to see that as a secondary goal?
To use David's example, I think the responsible thing for the managers to do is to seek the testimony of Mike Pence. Let's just take Mike Pence as an example. They have alleged that his life was in danger and the president was content to let the mob murder the vice president of the United States, and that he didn't reach out to him to check whether he was okay, right? I think having him tell that story, if they believe that story is true and they can get him to tell that story, I think they should do that. And I think, let the Senate vote no. But they should ask. And I continue to believe that. And there's a series of witnesses like that. They have made claims about what the president was doing that day. I want to hear from Mark Meadows about those claims. I want to hear a TikTok from the president's chief of staff about what was happening that day. And I want Republican senators to have to hear that TikTok. So that's my parochial view, but I acknowledge it's a parochial view. All right, we have basically wrapped up our time. David, what are you looking for today? Is it going to be a clown show, or are they going to outperform what we expect of them?
No, I think it will be dramatically different than their first presentation, less folksy, more direct. I think we will be disappointed in the arguments and the distractions, but I think it will be a cleaner presentation.
Quinta?
Look, I mean, even if it's better than the first day, it will still be a clown show. That's not a very high bar. My expectations are not high. I'll be interested to see whether Trump's team changes their approach, given that the president or the former president was reportedly quite angry with them the first time around, or whether they continue to just try to bore and yell the senators into submission.
We are going to leave it there. We will be back tomorrow. We will be at a different time, 11 o'clock, not 9 o'clock, to bore and yell at you again for half an hour. See you tomorrow.